Blind alien girl reached for a familiar voice, and the human promised to be her eyes forever. The dying space station groaned like a wounded beast, its metal bones shrieking as another support beam gave way. Cargo pilot Renn Thorne cursed under his breath as his salvage scanner flickered with interference, the profitable haul of abandoned tech slipping further from his grasp with each structural failure. His tabby cat Whiskers paced the cockpit's narrow confines, orange fur standing on end as the feline's sensitive ears tracked sounds no human could hear. "Just 5 more minutes, girl," Renn muttered to the cat, fingers dancing over his ship's controls. "Then we're gone before this rust bucket takes us with it." That's when the voice cut through the static, small, terrified, but unmistakably familiar. "Voice that sings? Voice that sings, please! The walls are falling and I can't find the way out." Renn's blood turned to ice. He knew that voice, had heard it only once before during a brief cargo delivery to the refugee sector 3 months ago. A blind alien child who'd called his radio chatter the voice that sings because of his habit of humming old Earth folk songs between comm checks. He'd thought it was cute at the time, had even sung her a lullaby when she couldn't sleep near the loading docks. Whiskers suddenly yowled, pressing against the view screen as if trying to reach something beyond the glass. The cat's whiskers twitched frantically, picking up vibrations that made her entire body quiver with distress. "Kira," Renn called into his comm, abandoning the salvage scan entirely. "Kira, is that you? Voice that sings." The relief in her transmission was heartbreaking. "The floor songs changed. They're screaming now instead of humming, and I can't hear the safe paths anymore." Renn's throat constricted. She was talking about her echolocation, the way she navigated by listening to how sounds bounced off surfaces. If the station's structural damage was interfering with her ability to read the acoustic landscape, she was as good as dead. His salvage contract flashed red on the screen. Penalty clauses for abandoning a profitable run would cost him 3 months' income. Corporate didn't care about stranded refugees. They wanted their tech recovered before the station's inevitable collapse destroyed everything valuable. The rational choice was clear. Complete the salvage, report the transmission to emergency services, and let the professionals handle one lost child among thousands. Renn had learned long ago that heroes died broke and alone. But Whiskers was clawing at the controls now, her distress palpable, and somewhere in the dying station's bowels, a little girl was calling for the only voice she trusted in the universe. "Damn it all," Renn growled, killing the salvage routine and firing up his ship's emergency thrusters. "Kira, keep talking to me, sweetheart. I'm coming to get you," as his ship banked toward the station's unstable docking ports. Memories crashed over him like a tidal wave. Sarah's laugh echoing through their cramped apartment, her tiny hands trying to help him repair circuit boards on the kitchen table. The factory supervisor's grim expression when they'd brought him her personal effects. A broken doll and the lucky wrench she'd insisted on carrying to help Daddy fix things. 6 years since the industrial accident that had stolen his daughter, and Renn still woke up reaching for her presence beside his bunk. He'd sworn never to let anyone that close again, never to care enough that losing them could break him a second time. But this wasn't about him. This was about a scared little girl who trusted him enough to call out in the darkness, who'd somehow managed to wedge herself into the one crack left in his armored heart. "I can hear your ship's engine songs," Kira's voice crackled through increasing static. "They're beautiful, like silver bells in the deep spaces. But the station songs are getting uglier. Voice that sings. I think the big supports are about to stop singing entirely." Renn's jaw clenched. The kid was right. His instruments showed critical structural failure spreading faster than projected. Whatever had caused the initial damage was accelerating, turning a slow collapse into an imminent catastrophe. "Tell me where you are, Kira. Use the sound pictures like you showed me before. I'm in the place where the little machines sing in harmony. Lots of humming boxes that taste like electricity. But the harmony is getting sour, and there's a new taste. Sharp and cold, like broken metal. The server room, sub-level 7. Of course, she'd describe computer banks as singing machines. Renn punched coordinates into his navigation system while Whiskers continued her anxious vigil, tail lashing as she tracked the alien child's distress through senses Renn could barely imagine. "I'm docking now, sweetheart. Don't move, don't try to find me. Just keep talking so I can follow your voice." "Voice that sings," Kira whispered, and he could hear the tears in her words. "I'm scared. The station songs are dying, and when they stop completely, I'll be lost in the quiet forever." Renn's boots rang against the station's corroded decking as he followed Whiskers through the maze of corridors. The cat moved with supernatural confidence, tail held high like a beacon, occasionally pausing to sniff the air and adjust course. Her whiskers twitched constantly, reading vibrations that guided them unerringly toward their goal. The scene in the server room nearly stopped his heart. Kira sat curled in the corner between two massive processing units, her pale blue skin almost luminescent in the flickering emergency lighting. She was smaller than he'd remembered, barely 8 years old in human terms, with the delicate features of her species and those distinctive silver eyes that saw nothing but reflected everything. "Voice that sings," she whispered, head tilted in that particular way that meant she was reading the acoustic signature of his approach. "Right here, sweetheart." Renn knelt beside her, noting the fresh cuts on her arms where she'd navigated through debris. "Are you hurt?" Instead of answering, Kira reached out tentatively until her fingers found Whiskers, who immediately began purring and rubbing against the child's palm. The transformation was instantaneous. Tension melted from Kira's shoulders as she buried her face in the cat's fur. "She smells like safety," Kira murmured, "and her purr songs are perfectly tuned. I can feel them in my bones." Over the next hour, as they waited for the station's emergency systems to clear a safe evacuation route, Renn watched in amazement as Kira and Whiskers formed an extraordinary bond. The cat seemed to instinctively understand the child's needs, positioning herself to provide tactile reference points, and even guiding Kira's hands to stable surfaces. "You know," Renn said, sketching rough maps on a piece of salvaged metal with his plasma cutter. "Back on Earth, we used to train animals to help blind folks navigate. Never seen it happen naturally like this." Kira's fingers traced the raised lines he'd burned into the metal, her expression growing thoughtful. "Whiskers doesn't just help me walk. She helps me understand the songs better. When she purrs, it's like having another instrument in the orchestra that makes all the other music clearer." "What do you mean by songs, exactly?" Renn had wondered about this since their first meeting. "Everything sings, voice. That sings. The walls hum with their structural harmonies. Flowing water makes liquid melodies. Even the air carries the echoes of things moving through it." Kira's hands moved expressively as she spoke, painting pictures in the air. "When I listen to the songs, I can see the shapes of things, the spaces between them. It's how I know where to walk." She paused, then added quietly, "Your voice sings too, but differently. Most voices just make sounds, but yours carries music underneath. It makes the world feel warmer." Before Renn could respond, the station shuddered violently. Warning klaxons began wailing, and his comm crackled with emergency broadcasts announcing immediate evacuation procedures. "We need to move," he said. But Kira was already shaking her head. "The evacuation songs are wrong," she insisted. "They're sending people through the twisted corridors where the harmonies are broken. Some of those paths won't hold weight much longer." Renn checked his readings. The evacuation routes had been programmed days ago, before the latest structural failures. If Kira was right, if her sonic abilities could detect weaknesses that instruments missed, then hundreds of refugees were walking into death traps. "Can you find a better way?" he asked. Kira stood carefully, one hand resting on Whiskers' back while the other extended into the air, fingers splayed as if feeling for invisible threads. She moved with surprising grace, pausing every few steps to listen intently. "There," she said finally, pointing toward what looked like a maintenance shaft. That path's song is clean and strong. It leads to the docking bays through the stable bones of the station. As they made their way through Kira's chosen route, Renn found himself marveling at her abilities. She didn't just avoid obstacles. She anticipated them, reading the acoustic shadows cast by dangling cables or loose panels before they came into view. When they reached junction points, she'd pause to listen to the different harmonies of each possible path, selecting routes with the confidence of someone reading a map. They weren't alone. Other refugees had noticed their unconventional path and began following, trusting the blind child's navigation over official evacuation procedures. By the time they reached the docking area, nearly 200 beings trailed behind them. "How did you know?" asked a Zenthari engineer, his crystalline features reflecting bewilderment. "Our sensors showed that maintenance tunnel was compromised." Kira tilted her head thoughtfully. "Your sensors listen to electricity and radio waves. I listen to the bones and breath of the station itself. Different songs, different truths." The evacuation ships were loading when Commander Litha Vex appeared, her tall frame cutting through the crowd with military precision. Kira's mother possessed the same ethereal beauty as her daughter, but carried herself with the weight of command. Her silver eyes, functional, unlike Kira's, fixed on Renn with undisguised suspicion. "You're the cargo pilot," she said without preamble. "The one who abandoned a profitable salvage run." "That's right." Renn kept his voice steady despite the intensity of her gaze. "Why?" It was a simple question with a complex answer. Renn looked down at Kira, who was teaching Whiskers to respond to subtle hand signals, their communication already evolving into something deeper than words. "Because she asked for help," he said finally, "and because sometimes the right thing is the only thing." Litha's expression softened fractionally, but her posture remained guarded. "My daughter has mentioned you. The voice that sings who made the cargo bay feel less frightening. I just hummed a few old songs while working. Didn't think she'd remember. Kira remembers every voice she's ever heard, but yours is the only one she's ever trusted enough to call for help." Litha's gaze shifted to where her daughter sat cross-legged on the deck. Whiskers curled in her lap while other refugee children gathered around them, fascinated by the unusual friendship. "She saved a lot of lives today," Renn said. "Her navigation abilities are remarkable." "And dangerous," Litha replied sharply. "There are those who would exploit such gifts, use her as a living sensor array without regard for her well-being." The warning was clear. Don't get ideas about profit from her daughter's abilities. Renn felt a flicker of anger at the implication, but understood the protective instinct behind it. "She's not a tool," he said quietly. "She's a little girl who deserves to be safe and happy." For the first time, Litha's military mask slipped slightly. "Yes," she whispered. "She is." 3 weeks later, Renn found himself living in quarters adjacent to the Vex family aboard Sanctuary Station, a massive orbital habitat that served as temporary home to 50,000 refugees from various conflicts. His official designation was Civilian Specialist Consultant, which basically meant he fixed things that stumped the engineers and kept Kira company when her mother was busy with command duties. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until the refugees could be relocated to permanent settlements. But as Renn watched Kira teach a group of young aliens to play a tactile version of hide-and-seek, using sound mapping techniques to find each other in the station's recreational areas, he found himself hoping for delays in the resettlement process. "She's thriving here," Litha said, appearing beside him at the observation deck's railing. "I haven't seen her this confident since before the war started." "She's got natural leadership instincts," Renn replied, watching as Kira patiently helped a timid Corvani child understand the basics of echolocation. "And she's teaching these kids skills that could save their lives." It was true. Word had spread about the sound seer who could navigate by listening to structural harmonies, and refugee families had begun bringing their children to learn from her. Kira had responded by developing a curriculum of sorts, teaching basic acoustic awareness to anyone willing to listen. But it was during one of these informal lessons that disaster struck. The station's chief engineer, a gruff Terran named Dmitry Kozlov, burst into the recreational area with panic written across his weathered features. "Commander Vex, we need your daughter's abilities. Now." Litha's expression immediately turned glacial. "Absolutely not. I won't have her used as—" "The station's core support matrix is failing," Kozlov interrupted. "Microscopic stress fractures spreading through the primary load-bearing structures. Our instruments can't pinpoint the exact locations, and we've got maybe 6 hours before catastrophic failure." Renn felt the blood drain from his face. 50,000 people, and nowhere near enough evacuation capacity if the station came apart. "What do you need?" Kira asked quietly, having approached while the adults argued. "Kira, no," Litha said firmly. "You're not a diagnostic tool. But I can help, can I?" The little girl's voice carried a note of hope that made Renn's chest tighten. "I can listen to the station's deep songs, find where the harmonies are breaking?" Kozlov nodded desperately. "The stress fractures create subtle changes in acoustic resonance. If you could identify the compromised areas, we could reinforce them before total failure." "It's too dangerous," Litha protested. "The kind of deep sonic scanning you're talking about would require her to interface directly with the station's structure. The feedback could damage her hearing, maybe permanently." Renn found himself thinking of Sarah again, how she'd insisted on helping with dangerous repair work despite his protests, how her determination to contribute had ultimately led to her death. But this was different. This wasn't about proving herself. This was about survival for thousands of innocent people. "What if we could amplify her abilities somehow?" he suggested. "Reduce the strain while increasing effectiveness." Kozlov looked skeptical. "How?" "Her sonic capabilities are biological, not technological. Maybe not directly, but—" Renn's mind raced through possibilities, drawing on years of practical experience with acoustic systems in cargo operations. "When I was hauling freight through asteroid fields, we used harmonic resonance to detect structural flaws in ship hulls, created standing wave patterns that highlighted stress points." "You want to use industrial equipment on a child?" Litha said flatly. "I want to create a partnership," Renn corrected. "Kira provides the biological sensitivity. The machinery provides amplification and filtering. She stays safe while getting the information we need." It took an hour to jury-rig the system, connecting the station's communications array to a modified cargo scanner that Renn had extensively customized over the years. Kira sat in the center of the improvised setup, Whiskers purring reassuringly in her lap, while sensor nodes created a supportive web around her. "Can you hear the station's deep songs now?" Renn asked, fine-tuning the harmonic frequencies. Kira's expression grew distant, her head tilting as she listened to sounds far below human perception. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, it's beautiful and terrible. The station sings like a great instrument, but there are broken strings, places where the melody fractures and turns sour." Over the next 3 hours, she guided repair teams to 17 critical stress points scattered throughout Sanctuary Station's superstructure. Each location she identified proved to contain microscopic fractures that would have propagated into catastrophic failures within hours. The engineers worked frantically to install reinforcement struts and inject structural foam into the compromised areas. But it was exhausting work. Despite the technological assistance, the deep sonic scanning took a tremendous toll on Kira's abilities. By the end of the emergency, she was pale and shaking, barely able to maintain her usual confident navigation around familiar spaces. "I can't hear the close songs as clearly," she whispered to Renn as he carried her back to their quarters. "Everything sounds fuzzy." "It'll come back," he assured her, though he wasn't certain. "You just need rest." Litha was waiting in their common area, her expression a mixture of gratitude and fury. "Thank you," she said formally to Renn. "You may have saved us all. But if you ever put my daughter at risk like that again—" "I won't need to," Renn interrupted. Because now I know what she's capable of, and I'm going to make sure she's never in a position where using those abilities is her only option." The statement hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to address directly. But something had shifted during the crisis, some acknowledgement of shared responsibility that went beyond temporary arrangements. "She trusts you completely," Litha said finally, settling into a chair across from where Renn sat with the sleeping child. "Do you understand what that means to my people? Trust given freely, without reservation. It's considered sacred." "I won't betray it," Renn promised. "I know." Litha's voice was soft, thoughtful. "That's what frightens me. She's already lost so much. Her sight, her birth world, her father. If she loses you too." "She won't." The words came out with more certainty than Renn had felt about anything in years. "I'm not going anywhere." Litha studied his face for a long moment, reading something there that seemed to satisfy her. "Good," she said simply, "because I think I'm beginning to trust you too." The attack came without warning 3 days later, just as Kira's hearing was starting to recover from the deep scanning ordeal. Renn was in the middle of teaching her how to identify different types of metal alloys by their acoustic signatures when the station's defense klaxons began screaming. "All civilians to emergency shelters," the automated system announced. "This is not a drill. Hostile forces have breached the outer perimeter." Through the viewing port, Renn could see the sleek, dark shapes of hegemony raiders closing fast on the station. These weren't random pirates. This was a coordinated military assault designed to capture or eliminate the refugee population before they could be relocated. Litha's voice crackled through the comm system. "All defense personnel to stations. We have multiple breaches on levels 7 through 12. Civilian evacuation protocols are in effect immediately." But as refugees began flooding toward the evacuation bays, a new crisis emerged. The emergency systems that should have guided civilians to safety were failing, their routing algorithms confused by the structural repairs made during the previous emergency. Evacuation routes were sending people directly toward combat zones or leading them into sealed-off sections of the station. "The evacuation songs are wrong again," Kira said, pressing her hands against the wall to feel the vibrations of movement throughout the station. "But worse this time. People are walking toward the fighting sounds." Renn activated his personal comm. "Commander Vex, the evacuation system is compromised. Your people are being directed into danger zones." "I know," Litha's response was tight with stress. "But I can't pull personnel from defensive positions to guide civilians manually. We're barely holding the raiders back as it is." Kira stood up suddenly, her expression determined despite the fear in her silver eyes. "I can guide them, not everybody at once, but groups at a time. I know all the safe paths through the station now." "Absolutely not," Renn said immediately. "You're still recovering, and there are armed raiders out there." "But people are dying," Kira replied simply. "I can hear their fear songs getting quieter, if someone doesn't help them find the right paths." She was right, and they all knew it. Every minute the evacuation remained chaotic meant more civilian casualties. But sending a blind child into a combat zone violated every protective instinct Renn possessed. "If we do this," he said carefully, "we do it together. You guide, I guard. And Whiskers comes with us to watch for dangers you might not detect." It was a compromise that satisfied no one but offered the only viable solution. Within minutes, they were moving through the station's service corridors while Kira used her sonic abilities to locate groups of stranded civilians and lead them to safety. The first group they found, 12 Zenthari families trapped in a recreation area when the emergency lockdown sealed their exit, followed Kira's guidance with desperate gratitude. She led them through maintenance passages and auxiliary corridors that bypassed the main combat zones, her acoustic mapping abilities allowing her to predict which routes would remain secure. But it was during the third evacuation run that they encountered real danger. A squad of hegemony raiders had penetrated deep into the civilian sections, systematically hunting for high-value targets. Renn heard their approaching footsteps just seconds before they rounded the corner. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Kira. drawing the emergency plasma cutter that was his only weapon. Whiskers hide. The fighting was brief and brutal. Renn's years of cargo handling had given him practical knowledge of improvised weapons and dirty tactics that served him well against the raiders' superior firepower. But it was Kira who turned the tide of the engagement. "The walls are singing wrong where they're standing," she told him urgently. "That section isn't as strong as it looks. The support beam beneath them has stress fractures." Understanding immediately, Renn adjusted his plasma cutter to maximum dispersal and fired at the deck plates under the raiders' feet. The weakened support structure couldn't handle the thermal shock. The entire section collapsed, dropping their attackers into the level below. "How did you know?" Renn asked as they resumed their evacuation mission. "The fighting songs told me," Kira replied matter-of-factly. "When people move quickly and heavily, they create different vibration patterns depending on what they're standing on. Solid structure sounds, different from compromised structure. They saved 83 civilians that day, guiding them through a maze of damaged corridors and combat zones to reach the evacuation bays. But the effort took a severe toll on Kira, whose still-recovering abilities were pushed far beyond their limits. By the time the raiders were repelled and the immediate crisis passed, she was barely conscious, supported between Renn and a very concerned Whiskers who refused to leave her side. "You did it," Litha said, appearing in the medical bay where Kira was receiving treatment for exhaustion and acoustic overload. "Casualty reports show the lowest civilian losses in any comparable attack. The evacuation efficiency improved by over 300% once you began guiding people." But her gratitude was tempered by concern as she looked at her daughter's pale, drawn features. "The doctors say her hearing may be permanently affected. The strain of using her abilities while they were still recovering." "She made the choice," Renn said quietly. "I tried to talk her out of it. I know. And I also know that without your protection, she would never have survived long enough to save those families." Litha sat down beside Kira's medical bed, taking her daughter's small hand in both of hers. "You kept her safe while she kept others safe. That's what partners do." The word hung between them, loaded with implications that neither had been willing to acknowledge before. Partnership meant permanence, shared responsibility, commitment that transcended temporary arrangements or convenient alliances. "Commander," Renn began formally. "Litha," she corrected softly. "If you're going to be family, you should use my name." Family. The word hit Renn harder than any raider's weapon could have. For 6 years, he'd convinced himself that family was a luxury he couldn't afford, a vulnerability he couldn't survive losing again. But looking at Kira's sleeping face, feeling Whiskers purring against his leg, seeing the hope and trust in Litha's eyes, he realized that family wasn't something you chose to have or not have. Sometimes it chose you. "Litha," he said carefully, "if you're offering what I think you're offering, I'm offering everything," she replied simply. "Legal guardianship of Kira, matrimonial partnership with me, full integration into our family unit. The ceremonies would make it official, but the commitment starts now if you're willing." Renn looked at the 3 beings who had somehow managed to slip past all his defenses and make themselves indispensable to his continued existence. Kira, who trusted him to be her eyes and voice in a universe that seemed determined to hurt her. Whiskers, who had appointed herself guardian of their unconventional pack. And Litha, who was offering him a chance to be part of something larger and more meaningful than mere survival. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "To all of it." The ceremony took place 6 weeks later in Sanctuary Station's Central Plaza, which had been transformed into a garden space filled with plants from a dozen different worlds. Representatives from multiple species attended, turning what could have been a simple legal proceeding into a celebration of interspecies cooperation and unity. Kira stood between Renn and Litha, wearing formal robes of her people that shimmered with embedded fiber optics, creating patterns of light that she could feel as well as others could see. Her hearing had stabilized at about 80% of its previous sensitivity, but she'd adapted by developing new techniques that combined her remaining sonic abilities with enhanced tactile awareness. Today we witness the formation of bonds that transcend the traditional boundaries of species and origin, intoned Elder Varix, the Zenthari dignitary who'd volunteered to officiate the mixed species ceremony. Renn Thorne of Earth, do you accept responsibility for the well-being and protection of Kira Vex, to serve as her guardian, guide, and advocate until she reaches the age of independence? I do, Renn replied firmly, placing his hand over Kira's smaller one. I promise to be her eyes when she needs them, her voice when she cannot speak, and her strength when her own fails. And do you, Kira Vex, accept Renn Thorne as your chosen guardian and guide, to honor him as you would a birth parent? Kira's response was clear and confident. I do. He is my Papa voice, and I trust him with all the songs of my heart. The adoption ceremony was followed immediately by the matrimonial rites, as Litha and Renn exchanged vows that had been carefully crafted to respect both human and Zenthari traditions. Whiskers sat at their feet throughout the proceedings, wearing a small ceremonial collar that marked her as an official family member with full legal protections. But the personal ceremonies were only the beginning. In recognition of his service during both the structural crisis and the Raider attack, Renn was granted full Zenthari citizenship and the honorary title of Void Walker, one who moves safely through dangerous spaces. More practically, he was offered the position of Chief Civilian Safety Coordinator for all refugee operations in the sector. The job comes with significant authority, explained Administrator Chen, the human official overseeing refugee resettlement. You'd be responsible for developing new evacuation protocols based on the acoustic mapping techniques you and Kira pioneered. Every station and settlement in the refugee network would benefit from these innovations. The implications were staggering. The combined approach they'd developed, human engineering knowledge enhanced by Zenthari acoustic sensitivity, could revolutionize safety procedures throughout known space. Instead of relying purely on technological sensors that could be fooled or compromised, evacuation systems could incorporate biological awareness of structural integrity and environmental hazards. We estimate the new protocols could reduce civilian casualties during emergencies by up to 70%. Chen continued. That's potentially thousands of lives saved across the refugee population alone, not counting the broader applications for civilian populations. But perhaps more importantly, their success had opened new avenues for interspecies cooperation. The refugee community at Sanctuary Station had evolved from a collection of displaced populations into a genuine multicultural society, with Zenthari sonic awareness combining with human engineering, Corvani environmental expertise, and a dozen other species' unique capabilities. You've created something unprecedented, Litha told Renn as they stood on the observation deck, watching Kira teach a mixed group of children how to play her sound mapping games. Not just a family, but a model for how different species can work together. Renn watched his daughter, and she was his daughter now, legally and emotionally, patiently guide a young human boy through the basics of listening to structural harmonies. The boy was completely sighted but fascinated by Kira's ability to see through sound. And she was delighted to have a student who approached her techniques from a completely different sensory perspective. She's the one who made it possible, he replied. I just provided the technical support. We all made it possible, Litha corrected, moving closer until her shoulder touched his. Kira provided the abilities, you provided the engineering knowledge. I provided the authority to implement changes. Even Whiskers provided the emotional support that kept us all functional during the crisis. It was true. Their unconventional family had become something greater than the sum of its parts, each member contributing unique strengths that complemented the others. Renn's practical problem-solving abilities were enhanced by Kira's sensory gifts and Litha's leadership experience, while his emotional growth had provided the stability that allowed both mother and daughter to thrive. Papa Voice, Kira called from the plaza below. Can you come help us build the new listening maze? We need someone who understands how metal sings when it's properly tuned. Renn looked at Litha, who smiled and nodded toward their daughter. Go. I'll handle the administrative reports. As he made his way down to the plaza, Whiskers padding beside him with her tail held high, Renn reflected on how completely his life had changed. 6 months ago, he'd been a lonely cargo pilot with no connections beyond his cat, no responsibilities beyond his next paycheck, no purpose beyond simple survival. Now he was a father, a husband, a citizen of 2 worlds, and a pioneer in interspecies cooperation. The wounded part of himself that had been frozen since Sarah's death had finally begun to heal, not through forgetting his lost daughter, but by honoring her memory through the protection and nurturing of another child who needed him. The metal framework needs to create specific harmonic intervals, Kira explained as he knelt beside her project. Each section should produce a different tone when touched, so children can learn to identify materials and stress levels through sound. Smart design, Renn approved, examining her sketches. But we'll need to adjust the resonance frequencies to account for different species' hearing ranges. Already planned for, she replied proudly. The bass harmonics will be audible to humans, but there are overtones for Zenthari hearing and subsonic components for species like the Corvani. Looking at his daughter's brilliant smile, feeling his wife's proud gaze from the observation deck above, and listening to Whiskers' contented purring, Renn realized that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all his life without knowing it. A place where his voice truly belonged, where his songs could help others find their way home.